Good morning, everyone. Very warm welcome to the February 2022 edition of the Prajnya Gender Talks seminar series. We are delighted to have Professor and historian Divya Kannan with us today. Those of you who have been following Prajna's work for some time might recall that the series used to be called the Women's History Roundtable series. And although the sessions do feature speakers from a wide range of disciplinary backgrounds and from outside academia as well, we are always thrilled when we can have a historian join us and sort of remind us of the roots of the series, which we have been running in some form or the other since 2008. I'm going to introduce the speaker now. Divya Kannan is a professor of history at Shiv Nadar University. Her main areas of research, particularly with the focus on South Asia, include histories of childhood and youth, gender and sexuality studies, empires and colonial violence, histories of education, curriculum and pedagogy, public and oral histories. She is also the co-founder of the Critical Childhoods and Youth Studies Collective, which seeks to bring together academics and practitioners working with and on young people across South Asia. So Divya's talk today will be on writing histories of childhood in India. She'll speak for around 40 minutes, and after that we will open the floor for questions from the audience. If you'd like to, in the meanwhile, leave a question in the chat box, please feel free to do so. And I request everyone to please keep your mics on mute while Divya is speaking. Over to you, Divya.
Thank you so much, Shakti. I'm delighted to be here today, and I'd like to thank Swarna, Shakti, and Mariam for making this possible. They've patiently pursued me over the last 1 year. I do have a PPT just to aid the talk, and I'll request Mariam if she could start screening the PPT. Yeah, you could make it full screen. Sure. Okay. So many of you might be wondering what this talk is about. History of childhood is not something that you frequently hear. And therefore, let me begin by taking a bit of an anticipatory bail. That is, I'm not a lawyer who works with children or cases involving children, nor am I a policy specialist that is drafting policies for children. And the reason why I say this is because every time I mention to people my interest is in the histories of childhood, I'm immediately, and I think rightly asked, whether it has any social impact. While I mean, that would be the ideal situation for scholars such as us to have, public policy impact. My larger challenge is to unsettle some of the commonplace assumptions we have about the topic, and also enable both practitioners and academics and pedagogues to historicize childhood, to understand it in a long-term perspective, in order to process what is happening in the present. Therefore, I begin by broadly outlining the field, briefly touching upon the specific thematic concerns in the scholarship on India, and then I move on to elucidate some of the core arguments with examples from my own work, and I shall conclude in the last few minutes of the talk. Of course, there's also an assumption that those working on children or childhood in history are dealing with a less theoretically heavy subject. That's a criticism, or let's say a pejorative remark we often hear, that, oh, your subject is so easy to do in history, so on and so forth. I strongly disagree with this view. And I shall demonstrate why I disagree with this view. Is because it makes a very flawed assumption that everything that is happening around us is for the adults, by the adults, and about the adults, which is really not the case, right? So it's absolutely anachronistic and inaccurate to state that everything in world history, whether it's in the past or in the contemporary, has to do with adults. While adults may be at the hem of many of these decision making processes and leading some of these phenomena, it's undoubtedly true that it affects children, and children shape what is going around them. Because there is no evidence to show that in any historical epoch there were only adults in the world. There were children and adults. The other thing is, childhood is inherently political. Because we do not remain children for the rest of our lives. Everybody here in this room, you have been a child once upon a time, and albeit it's a temporary stage of life. And therefore, studying childhood and its shifts across time and space has implication for children located in different material and cultural contexts. And which means historians such as myself we inevitably study society, economy, polity, and its interlinkages in all complexities. Mariam, if you could move to the next slide. So, just to elaborate on this point, the first question that we often ask ourselves in the field is, what is childhood? If I were to ask all of you here, what is quantum physics or what is evolutionary biology, I'm likely to receive some responses such as, I don't really know, or maybe I haven't read enough about it, or right, it's not my interest. But if I asked you all what is childhood or who is a child, I'm very likely to receive responses from all of you. And that is because there is such a sentimentalized view of childhood. It is bound up with who we are as human beings. And it shapes our moral compass, our ethical understandings of the world, our habits, our ways of being. And so even if you don't know anything about subjects like quantum physics, you know everything and anything about childhood. But for the academic who is studying childhood as a subject of historical study, what this really tells us is that childhood is a politicized category. That is, it is located at the interstices of power differentials. Despite all our love and affection for children, we know that children in South Asia, particularly in countries like India, remain subordinate in family and non-family arrangements. So no matter how much we romanticize childhood or romanticize the figure of the child as a moral and social unit is inherently subordinated to all power arrangements until they, of course, take on the roles of adulthood. The other thing that scholars now widely agree, and this is no longer disputed, is that childhood is a social construct. This is not to say childhood in its biological sense or at the level of our biological development is a social construct, but the norms that govern childhood, who is a good child, what are acceptable behaviors, whether a child should have sexual freedom or not, should children be allowed to vote, so on and so forth, are social and political constructs, which means that childhood shifts across time and space and cultural context. You cannot say that the childhood in 1850s or the understandings of childhood in 1850s or 1750s was the same as 1950s, so on and so forth. The other major point I would like to keep across to all of you is that when you say what is childhood, you have to look at it in an intersectional perspective. Every child does not have the same childhood. You could, of course, argue with me and say, but isn't childhood age related? But we today agree in the field that age in itself is a messy category to deal with. You could say children below, everybody below 12 is a child. Some countries will say below 18. We also in India say below 18, you're considered a child. But at the same time, you have children on the streets. You have child laborers working in very hazardous activities. So if everybody below 18 is a child and must be protected, then how do you explain the existence of exploitative phenomena? How do you explain the conditions of poverty that push certain children to do certain kinds of work? And therefore, one has to look at childhood intersecting with other identity markers, such as gender, such as ethnicity, language, and of course, in India, you can't avoid the question of caste, which is to say that even though we may all say that we have the same childhood, in reality, when it comes to experiential terms, we really do not have the same childhood. Because what you receive as a child, whether it's emotionally, socially, economically, is dependent on your other intersectional markers in the social apparatus. The other question that historians of childhood are facing is again, are you writing children's histories? And unfortunately, the answer to that is no. We are not writing children's histories, unlike sociologists and anthropologists, because someone like me, I am dealing with the dead, right? Therefore, when I look at dead children in the past, I do not often see archival traces or paper trails that they leave. Not just because of low literacy rates, but what children may have used or eaten or looked like are things that are very difficult for us to find in the context of the 18th and 19th century. So our key agenda for the history of childhood is not really to write children's histories, but to locate childhood as a discursive formation, as a material formation. We are interested in childhood as an ideological contestation, and thereby using scholarly analysis that emerge out of that contestation to challenge adultist imagination. Just to illustrate a point, many of my colleagues work on military histories, on economic histories, and they talk as if there were no children in the world at that time. And to just go back to what I started my talk with, and when we say we challenge adultist imagination, we are also trying to show that every history that we are talking about is inevitably the history of childhood as well. If it is about history of adults, then naturally it is also about the history of children. And when adults talk about childhood, it is an investment in the notion of futurity. That is why when I asked you all what is childhood, or if after the talk, if many of you were to comment, either you look at childhood through a lens of nostalgia of your own past, varying degrees of selective memory, what you think are good memories of your childhood or bad memories. But at the same time, there is an aspect of comparison with today's children. You are also worried about the future of society. And because children are at the center of this process of social and sexual reproduction, the concept of childhood carries both the notion of the past, present, as well as the future. It is always oriented towards the future. You are constantly preparing the child for the future, for future activities, to assume different power roles, to take on different gendered identities. Whether it's questions of climate change or conflict, we are all worried about the future, which we see through the eyes of children, or we imagine future generations of children will have to go through. The other core aspect of the field in the last 20 years is that we've been trying to understand how best to study childhood. Is it enough to just borrow from other perspectives and then fit in child? This has been a problem with women's studies as well, and this is no longer accepted that you write a history and then add women as an addition to it. Everything happened and then you say, okay, this woman did that, this woman did that. That's really not the point here. We are trying to understand how childhood is located in the creation of a power knowledge system, and what are the different kinds of childhoods that are part of this power differential system. So, for instance, in India, we know that upper caste children wield more power than lower caste children. We know that children of the minority suffer very differently from children belonging to majoritarian communities. We know that children of the rich have a very different social and political perception compared to all other children who come from varying economic classes. And therefore, age cannot be the fixed category of analysis. Or, in other words, if we were to understand children only by chronological age, by numerical age, then we would not be able to explain various other kinds of phenomena. And in the last 20 years, very brilliant historians such as Ishita Pandey, Satadru Sen, Karen Valgada, they have all tried to argue that one has to unsettle this fixity of age. And Ishita Pandey, in particular, in a very recent work, which was published in 2021, called Sex, Law, and Age in Colonial India, she very forcefully argues that discourses from medicine and law have contributed to this fixedness of age as fundamental to understanding child, and how that is problematic in liberal justice frameworks. So, for instance, by law, you are a minor under 18. By law, you are a juvenile delinquent at a particular age. Law will determine your age of consent, age of majority, so on and so forth. And she says the problem with that are these fuzzy lines, these areas of gray that does not really work in the favor of the child, because when it actually comes to the court is simply not interested only in the age. Court is interested in other intersectional markers. And she makes a powerful case why we should look at age as an analytical category. Mariam, if you could move on to the next slide. I just want to also give all of you a brief overview of what is this field, how do historians study this field. And to begin with, we all refer to the name of Philippe Aries. He's a well-known French historian. And in the 1960s, 70s, he had a book called Centuries of Childhood. There are many editions of Centuries of Childhood, in which Aries argued that, based on his own research in medieval Europe, the children before the 17th century were not emotionally valued by their families. He looks at portraits and he says that because of high death rate and high birth rate in medieval European societies, families had a very cold and stoic approach to children. The kind of love and affection that today we associate with the parent-child relationship was not there before the 19th century. And as most of you here can imagine, it did not go down well with many historians of the period, who argued that Aries was imposing a kind of 1970 perspective backwards, and it really doesn't work. He was too harsh in his judgment, and just because there are high death rates of children, that necessarily does not mean that societies did not place an important value on children. And the counter to Philip Aries was not to romanticize the child, but to say that he perhaps had a point, and he did have a point in establishing the fact that childhood is a social construct, even though other points were not agreed upon. And historians who countered Aries try to show that in pre 19th century societies in Europe, children were looked at very differently dependent on the role that they were made to do. And perhaps the distinction between the adult and the child was less among the vast population in Europe, especially the laboring classes. That is to say, except for the aristocratic child, every other child in European society was put to work at a very early age. Today, of course, we call it child labor, but in those days, you had to see children as economic assets. As soon as they turned 4 or 5, they were put to work either in the field or in the emergent factories. And scholars then started saying that we must also look for certain specific emotional formations. Perhaps parental love for children was not as valued as, for instance, obedience or docility or submission to hierarchy. That is to say, different societies will value different emotions depending on the way they look at childhood itself. And you can ask yourself today, when you think of what is a good child, there are some emotions that you attribute to being a good child. But what Aries had also shown is that by the 19th century, industrializing societies in Europe, because of the brutal system of child exploitation and labor, a group of reformers, poets, and artists started arguing that children have to be protected from the dangers of work and sexuality. These cities of London, Paris, Brussels, they all came to epitomize the worst excesses of industrialization. And there was a counter argument to the state that it is our responsibility as progressive societies, enlightened societies, to protect our children. And therefore, the trope of protection became very dominant from the early 19th century. This is not to say that beforehand there was no understanding of protection, but let me just briefly tell you two ways of thinking of the child. There was one, the Christian tradition, that believed that everybody was a born sinner. Yeah, children are original sinners. And the aim of parenting was to break down the will of the child. The child is born stubborn, born defiant, and one must punish the child accordingly so that they realize their mistakes and become submissive, docile beings. But this Christian view of the child changes by the 19th century, influenced by the Romantic tradition. So the poets who belong to the Romantic tradition, like William Wordsworth, etc., they're all now going to argue that children are equivalent to nature. Children represent what is pure in the world, and it is our responsibility as a civilized society to protect children. What does this protection really entail? This protection entails that they be separated from adult spaces of work and leisure. And what you now observe from the 19th century is that there are now distinct spaces for play and learning. Children are increasingly being withdrawn from arenas where there are adults interacting, especially agriculture and industry, and put in institutionalized sites where different groups of adults will debate on what is appropriate for their psychological and physical development. And all of you can take a guess that institutionalized site is going to be what we today call the school. The school emerges in 19th century as the space where children ought to be. That they should not be outside working, they should be in the school. And we know the grip of this imagination of compulsory schooling. All countries today have laws on compulsory schooling, and it is driven by this notion of the state and societal protection over child. So 19th century, these states will also embark upon mass schooling, large scale campaigns for compulsory schooling in order to segregate the child and the adult. Now, it's not just enough to segregate them. You also have to create a system where you have to shape the spatial and temporal routines of children. So the school will now be imagined within routine timetables, which is why we all have timetables, right? Now 10 to 11, you do maths, 11 to 12, you do history, so on and so forth. And the idea of these routine, which is in fact borrowed from 18th century military school traditions, military training traditions, is to regulate children's bodies and energies. and to instill in them notions of self-restraint, independence, and eventually they will take on the acceptable moral roles of being adults in their respective societies. So what happens in the 19th century is the child becomes now an object of reform. And very often we see that this is centered around the lower middle class child. This is also the time when the bourgeoisie in Europe are also talking about how they ought to define their child in opposition to the working class child. And by the late 19th century, you will have various institutionalized sites for children: kindergartens, schools, juvenile prisons, reformatories, industrial schools, Boston schools. So you can name various establishments that will now come about to determine the pathways of childhood. So if you are a deviant child or somebody who has been branded as a delinquent, then you are sent to the reformatory. If you are a street child, you are taken into the orphanage or the asylum. And therefore, the state now enters the role, as opposed to what Aries was saying earlier, where parents were given the major responsibility. Now you have the state entering the role of quasi-parents and saying that we will provide child welfare, child health measures. The problematic assumption in this story that I just outlined to you in some detail is that by the 19th century, there forged this idea that the Western child, and very often the white child in Europe, as this universal child, universalism. And every other childhood in the world was now going to be measured along the yardstick of protection, of parental care, so on and so forth. And we know this is not just true about the Western child, but even in the questions of feminism, we see the white child emerging as the measure of high progress and enlightenment, and childhoods in the non-West seen as either incomplete childhoods, failed, backward, or weak childhoods. And this framework has unfortunately continued into the post-colonial era in various forms. You see that in international humanitarian campaigns, UN programs, developmental assistance, where the figure of the non-Western child is one of pity and desperation, and the Western child has apparently already attained the fruits of modernization. But the seeds of this story actually lie in the 19th century. I am not in the group of historians who make this binary that, okay, the universal child is Western and everybody else is local and provincial, and they are constantly battling it out. We are not having a very simplistic binary, universal versus local, because inevitably a lot of the ideas prevalent in 19th century Europe made its way into South Asia through the all-pervasive history of colonialism. And therefore, when we look at the histories of childhood in our countries, it is inevitable that we have to also look at the questions of colonialism. Mariam, could you shift to the next slide, please? Yeah, thank you. Now, why is colonialism important for us to study? Again, like I told you, colonialism is affecting children as much as it's affecting adults. But this time, because of the rule of racial difference, Indian children are not being seen with the same eye as the children are being seen in Europe. So notions of vulnerability and innocence that are cropping up in Europe are not naturally applicable to the Indian child, to the native child, because of the deep-rooted racialized suspicion of the colonized population. And we have scholars such as Satadru Sen who have very astutely shown that the Indian child is seen as a perverted figure, as what he calls the perverse adult, miniature adult, is what he says the colonial state looked at the native child. What does that really mean? One is colonialism was justified by saying that Indians and Africans are childlike. They do not have the ability to govern themselves. They are backward. They are superstitious, so on and so forth. And therefore, in infantilizing the Indian adult, what they were also trying to say is that the Indian child can never be a full-grown adult like the Englishman. In this case, it is the Englishman who considers himself to the pinnacle of the racial hierarchy. So on one hand, there is this political and social infantilization of the Indian population at large during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And at the same time, the Indian child is often seen as incomplete, will always pick up apparently the wayward ways of the native adults. And what colonialism does is that different groups of adults who are traveling across the empire are also going to start propagating ideas of childhood, which will very often clash with pre-existing views of childhood in a country like India. For instance, In order to bring about a new regime of child protection and child welfare, both Christian missionaries, reformers, and administrators are going to write voluminously about how the Indian parent is a corrupt influence. That Indian parents, either they love too little or they love too much. Many of you here in the audience who are probably coming from the development sector can, it might resonate with you. This is something that you hear even in today's debates, that South Asian parents are just either too authoritarian or too cold. And this has roots in colonial discourses. You have, especially the Christian missionaries, of course, they're coming for evangelization, but in order to do conversion practices, they have to target families, and they target the child, hoping that the child will influence the family. They are all going to participate in this discourse to say that the native parent is the biggest corrupting force in the life of the native child, which means that there is some hope still left for the native child. You can mold the Indian child in a way that is suitable to the interests of colonial rule, but you have to do away with the Indian parent. Now, how do you do away with the Indian parent? You can only do that, of course, like I told you earlier, through segregation, but now you will create a system of segregation where the Indian parent is devalued as an important figure of adult authority. But please remember, nothing in the colonialism is absolute. These are all relative histories. They are not never able to have an absolute control over the relationship between Indian parent and child. But both the missionaries and the colonial state, who otherwise had many tensions amongst each other, they are going to converge on this idea of sharing the civilizational, the burden of civilizing the savage. And to civilize the Indian savage, you will have to civilize their children. So if you look at Satadru Sen's work, you will see how he talks about children of princely families were taken away into, especially the sons were taken away into princely boarding schools. So today, you know, the Mayo College in Ajmer, we have many other famous boarding institutions in Rajputana states. They were all part of the program of the British to keep aristocratic children away from their families because of the fear that they will rebel against British rule. So the idea was to keep them as domestic aristocracy. They were trained in polo riding and Latin and French, everything similar to the English child in British public schools, in order to make them domestic elites, but subordinate to the official hierarchy in the colonial administration. But at the same time, there were also other children to worry about. And for instance, the mixed race children. Many European men in India had sexual affairs or marriages with local Indian women. And the empire was very, very concerned about what they called racial miscegenation, the mixing of the races. Today we call them Anglo-Indians, but at that time they were called Eurasians. And therefore you will now have a series of separate schools for Eurasian children, which are the military asylums, the Lawrence Asylum schools in the Himalayas. So a lot of these hill station schools that you today know about, they all started as schools for Eurasian children. And they had a different agenda. And then you move on to orphans, a large number of orphans in Indian society, especially due to famine, and drought and other agrarian conditions. They were now going to be put into various poorer missionary charity institutions. And Satadru Sen is saying this kind of arrangement of trying to take away children into different boarding apparatuses, he refers to this as the juvenile periphery of the empire. And I place Satadru Sen as the top of the list because his work has been very, very fundamental in the work of all the other historians that I'm not going to explain, but I've just put out the names if you're interested, and including my own work. Because what Satadru Sen is explicitly saying is that we are not looking at children. We're not really saying what did children feel in the 1900s. We really don't know what they felt. We're not saying where did children play. What we are interested is in this discursive category of childhood, and how are various adults contending over the body of the child in these formations. Indian parents, Christian missionaries, domestic elites, nationalist reformers, and the colonial state. So you see various adults fighting it out on this body of the child to have control. And what is this control for? The right to discipline and punish. And it is the failure of the colonial experiment. We call it colonial experiments because they could never establish that kind of a widespread influence where the Indian parent was separated from the Indian child. Those of you who are aware of history know that they were pretty successful in the settler colonies such as Australia and in Canada, where large number of indigenous children were taken away into residential schools, and we know that a genocide followed with their complete separation from their parents. That kind of a strategy is not adopted in a place like India, but they try it with children at the margins. So orphans, already marginalized in local Indian society. Eurasians, mixed race children whom both sides don't want and don't prefer. Again, they are the ones they are targeted. Targeting children of African slave laborers who were stranded in the ports of Bombay and Calcutta and Karachi at that time. And then you have the aristocratic child. And in doing this mapping, what I'm trying to tell you is that the Western model of childhood is completely fractured when it comes to play in the non-Western context because of this combination of both caste and race. And in my own work, what I try to show is that the poor child, and this refers to the lower caste child or the Dalit child, as we know today, is turned into a specific object of pity and humanitarian reform. Because one, in the Western model, all non-white children are subordinate, but when they come to the empire, when the play happens in the colony, you see that upper class children are valued more than lower caste subaltern children. Even for the missionaries, if you read missionary sources, missionaries are very keen to attract upper caste children. There is a belief that upper caste families are more spiritual, they are better people, they have, of course, landed assets, economic assets, so on and so forth. And the outcast child is completely dependent on the welfare of the missionary. But in my work, what I try to show is the poor child is still very central to this discourse of difference. Because in order to raise money in the West to continue their charitable activities, please remember the colonial state is not investing a lot of money. They're not really interested in spending their financial resources on poor Indian children. Therefore, they are asking the missionaries to do it. But when the missionaries are trying to raise money back in Europe, they have to constantly play on this rhetoric that Indian society is terrible and look at the figure of the poor child. Now, I'm not trying to argue that all missionaries are cut from the same cloth. This is, historians agree on this, that missionaries are very, very complex characters. Today, unfortunately, because of right wing populism, there is a notion that all missionaries were horrible. They gave money to the poor and the poor converted. I totally don't think the poor only go for money. The poor also have spiritual concerns and religious motives, so on and so forth. But the reason is caste, right? If outcast families were going to convert to Christianity or they were open to conversion, it is because of the feudal agrestic slavery nexus, particularly in parts of Madras presidency, Travancore, in parts of Bengal presidency, etc. So what you now see is an intersection of philanthropy, caste, and gender. And missionaries are now going to target children through schools and hospitals. So, two ways of targeting. One is you do direct preaching, you go to the market and you preach. They realize this is not really working. So, they try to do what is called an indirect civilization, that is to target children in the schools, hoping that they will then influence their parents. Statistically, we know that very few Indians converted in that method. And today, we know less than 5% of Indian population are Christians in the census, and that also shows the pervasive resilience of caste. I wouldn't say it in a positive sense, but caste was also not a static construct. Caste is constantly reshaping and resisting the influence of the missionaries. So on one hand, the missionary postures himself and herself as a savior of Indian children, and on the other hand, will reshape the poor children in order to become objects of philanthropic pity and to raise money. And we see that kind of history continuing, especially in Africa. Anytime you think of Africa, you think of the famine child or the drought stricken child or the child soldier, which is true, which is, of course, true about those countries, but you don't see anything else about African children. And therefore, what is the kind of emotion that is drawn out of you is constantly one of pity and feeling very bad for the children of Africa. But Africa, of course, is another story. But in India, this is what is being attempted in the 19th century. But along with Sony and Katrina Ellis and Karen Valgada, what I also argue is that it's not that Indian children are agency-less. That's what the colonial state and the missionaries wanted us to believe. They wanted us to think that we have no agency because of Indian adults, and it is our job to come save them. And what this colonial encounter does is it mutually constitutes the colonizer and the colonized. So, on one hand, English children or European children are also being constructed as saviors of brown children. There is this famous phrase by Gayatri Spivak, the famous post-colonial theorist, and she says, the whole idea of colonialism was white men saving brown women from brown men. I do a spin on it and I argue that the whole idea of child welfare and child rescue during colonial period was to show that white children saving brown children from brown adults. Right? The ultimate enemy is the brown adult, and white children are also now going to become the saviors. And you will now see that there is agency. There is agency among European children, which is now generated, and missionaries and the colonial state is asking them to participate in these global campaigns against child poverty and child sacrifice, etc. That you see. So, if you're interested, you will see a wide scholarship that shows English children actively posing as saviors of non-Western children. But on the other side, in the Indian subcontinent, what is happening is that we have to move away from the agency trap. This is a term from Mary Maines, a historian of childhood, that there is a tendency among people who work with children that we think that either we have to go to the archives and find one hero, we have to find one heroic figure of a child who takes on the system, or we think all children are passive victims. As a historian of childhood, I don't ascribe to both ends of the spectrum, because that is not how agency works. Agency cannot only be about individual resistance or individual victimhood. Children negotiate at every stage of their lives in order to survive, and that negotiation can take various forms. It can take the form of conformity, like we know in Nazi Germany, children did participate in the Hitler Young Squads. You have children who may resist in small ways, for instance, running away or acts of disobedience or arson, transgression, so on and so forth. You have children who enter into negotiation for limited rights while they remain children, so on and so forth. So, for us to understand the location of children's agency, we have to move away from the two extremes and to see it in relation to the category of adulthood and in relation to larger structures of power. That is to say, when you study childhood, you inevitably will have to interrogate categories of adulthood. And we know in a country like India that very often women are infantilized, right? So, this whole idea of women as cute. You often see this in YouTube videos. You see a film star, and below there are comments, oh, she's so cute and she's so bubbly. And the problem, it's not to say that they can't be cute and bubbly, but there is this constant infantilizing of the adult woman itself. And therefore, the category of the child is really not only applicable to Bal children who are younger in age, but also anybody who's subordinated in the power structure. And that opens up larger questions of this debate on agency and structure. Mariam, if you could move on to the next slide. Now, here are some photographs from the Basel Mission archives. This is part of my doctoral research. The Basel Mission were a group of German-speaking missionaries from Switzerland. They came to North Kerala, today what we call Malabar, and they were very active in setting up boarding schools. And I chose these photographs, one, because of their availability, and two, it is rather representative of many of the boarding schools that the missionaries set up in colonial India for poor children. Now, of course, you can say these are staged photos. It's like a choreographed photo. Children are being asked to look straight into the camera. But if you look carefully, children are involved in acts of labor. And we know from other textual records, from the Basel Mission annual reports, that the children in their orphanages came from lower caste. In Kerala, they came from the Tiya caste, which today is an OBC caste, and some Dalit children. And if you contrast it with the day schools that missionaries were running, like the Catholic missionaries had convent schools, the Protestants had their mission day schools, where upper caste children were attending, you don't see upper caste children doing labor like the way low caste children were made to do labor in the boarding schools. So they had to do labor in the orphanage as an act of giving back to the missionary. The missionary would constantly complain saying the Indian children are lazy, Indian children run away, they're disobedient, but it is often ascribed to the lower caste child. And it is one of our arguments. When I say our, many scholars such as myself argue that in this project of child reform, these colonial missionaries and the state, they reproduce caste labor hierarchies. That is to say, when imagining childhood at the local level, there is a local imagination, there is a global and national imagination, but at the level of the province, it is still the lower caste child who is kept at the bottom of the hierarchy, and their aspirations are limited. I don't know if many of you are aware of this, but in poor boarding schools by the missionaries, they were not taught English. Missionaries said there is no need for them to learn English. They are lower caste in their own community. They have to do hard work, but we will make them cleaner and nicer people, well-behaved children, and we will send them out to society. And who will occupy jobs? Upper caste children will occupy jobs. So there is a reproduction of domestic inequalities even in these colonial reforms. So the children here, while they might be posing for a photograph in 1902 and 1905, they were actually doing all this heavy labor, grinding, rice husking, washing clothes, taking care of younger children. And the argument goes that if we were only to look at colonialism as a saving grace, that they came and brought light to the people of India, that has to be unsettled, because Indian children are participating in their survival strategies. They're not receiving everything for free. Right? The missionaries are not giving anything for free. They have to work in order to earn their boarding and food in these institutions. Mariam, if you could move on to the next one. The other one is emotional formation. Like I told you, what the missionaries do is, because they want to denigrate and remove the Indian adult discursively from the imagination of childhood, there is going to be a lot of argument about how children must be loved. So by the late 19th century, as Philip Aries and others have shown, there is a great sentimentalization of childhood, which is what today we have. Right? If I ask you about children, I'm sure many of you here will say children have to be loved and they're cared, they're like flowers, they're delicate, they're innocent. Innocence is a trope that keeps coming. By the late 19th century, reformers, both Indian and American and British, as well as missionaries, are going to argue for the sentimentalization of the Indian child. That Indian child must be allowed to explore his or her potential. This is a picture of a famous missionary woman called Amy Carmichael, who worked in Andhra Pradesh, and she, of course, had a fair share of controversy. She dressed like a monk. She called herself Amma. She wanted to replace the actual mothers of some of these children. She adopted the two girls on the side who are wearing the beads. She adopted them, and she always had these photographs where she came across as this angelic mother, as opposed to the Indian mother who is ignorant and illiterate. But at the same time, you also see a difference in the deportment of the children. The children are now fully clothed. The children look happy. And now you have emotions such as happiness, which is valued for child. That is, happy childhoods are more desirable than anything else. And we see that in the Delhi happiness curriculum and in various other government strategies. Maria, yeah. Now, this is just an example of a letter that was published in a journal for children. This was a periodical for children. And like I told you, if you read, this is from John Sajjan. He worked in Bangalore, especially among the Tamil children in Bangalore. And if you look at the letter that he's writing to English children, he basically wants them to donate to the missionaries, where he says, pray for us and for all our dear children in the schools, and most of all for those little ones who are taught and even forced to worship idols. So there is this rhetoric of heathenism, that idolatry, Indian Hindus and Muslims as superstitious, so on, that is constantly being reproduced in the print media in Europe to create a notion of this Oriental exotic India, at the same time as an India that is not ever going to civilize and move forward in progress. So this is an example how English children were being shaped as imperial citizens in the 19th century. Mariam, next one. So this, just to conclude, I'm not going to the UNCRC or the United Nations Convention on Children's Rights, but just to sum up, a question that often comes to us is, how do we study history of childhood? That is, if children did not leave many paper documents, what do we do? That is a challenge. That is, in fact, one of the biggest challenges in the field of history that we have. We can't talk to children. But there is some hope. One, of course, through the missionary archives, one has to, of course, be very wary of the biases of the archive. But it does produce a lot of rich information. They did live with the children. They did, speak the local languages. So there is some kind of information we get from there. For the early 20th century, a lot of colleagues of mine are looking at advertisements. So the visual representation of children, print advertisements, TV advertisements, in order to understand class inequality. You take any advertisement in India today, it's always the middle class child who's talking about life insurance and car loan and Byju's technology. So you can already see what are the dominant notions of childhood playing out in the public sphere. Then, of course, there are autobiographies, if anybody is interested. These are, of course, filtered memories, but it still gives us some information. And if you're lucky, we also have children writing, for instance, in literary sources such as journals and periodicals, where children were sending in letters and stories. But the other thing is to have a dialogue with other subjects in the field, such as sociology and anthropology, who have given us the wealth of information to understand children. So by studying children in today's context, social anthropologists have given us some of the tools to understand the languages that articulate what children are and who they ought to be, so on and so forth. Just to sum up, we have the agency versus structure debate, which is now falling apart. One cannot look at it in a binary. You have the local versus global, which continues at international levels of policy making, but necessarily is not the case when you look at histories. Then you have scholars such as Sharda Balagopalan, who has now argued for terms such as multiple childhoods. To understand childhoods across temporal and spatial scales, to situate questions of inequality, power, and so on. Ultimately, what I'd like to conclude by saying is that the study of the history of childhood really reveals to us who we are as societies, just like other histories. And therefore, if we are interested in tackling some of the major concerns of our lives, or in understanding how we came to be, or who we are and why we are the way we are, we cannot avoid children in historical debates. We cannot have histories where adults only talk about adults, because that's not really true. Every adult is talking with a child in mind, either a real child in mind or an imaginary child in mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Divya. That was a really wonderfully rich talk. I think you gave us a really clear sense of how the category of childhood is socially constructed, and how it deserves to be seen as a kind of distinct category of analysis, but also how it intersects with categories like the family, with the state, and of course with colonialism. So I think you've given us a lot to think about. I see already a question from Dr. Swarna Rajagopalan, which I'm going to read out. And of course, if anyone else has any questions, please do feel free to unmute or type in the chat box. So Swarna says, this was a stunning talk, Divya. Thank you so much for giving us new ways to reflect on how we think about childhood. My question, the 2 years plus of COVID have been unusual in human history, or so we think. In what ways do they connect with different points in the historiographical journey you described? And also, if you would speculate, what might a historian in 2072 write about these times?
Okay, thank you so much for that, Swarna. I mean, I can also see some of my acquaintances here, Sony and Srijit, who also work on this field. They might know better than me. But from the top of my head, what I can say is COVID may seem very unusual to us, but this is not the first time a pandemic has been taking place in the world. There has been the influenza pandemic, the plague pandemics, and there have been methods of segregation and vaccination also employed. But what I think is stunning for us is the role of technology in understanding today's pandemic situation. So historiographically, although the scholars that I referred here do not really talk about disease and medicine, but the journey of the pandemic across centuries have also determined how families and societies look at children, especially when large number of children have died. What have been the emotional shifts within the sites of the family for children who have survived, and how do states proactively, if they do at all, take this into account. But we also know there has been a politics of inequality. So for instance, if anyone's interested and you look at the work of Lydia Murdoch, she says when the experiments for vaccination started, Edward Jenner used a Eurasian girl in Bombay, to inject the pus with, and then that was later inoculation started. So there are also these racial and class hierarchies where the experiments for vaccination and medicine poor children have been subject to that in order to privilege non-poor children. But in 2072, it's a great question, Swarna, but I really don't know. But I think the social media has a big role to play to tell us how children felt. And nowadays we have children also producing. But I think we may also be living through a dystopian time because climate change is happening so fast and pandemic has now become almost endemic in our lives. I can only speculate what 2072 will hold, but I'm also seeing a situation where many societies will have lesser children, especially in the developed parts of the world. We will have extreme conflict, both environmentally and otherwise. But for a country like India, I think the question is already here. We have a large population of young people, and you can already see the tensions brewing. I dread to think what will happen in 2072, because we have not even gotten the basics of universal life correct, right? We haven't even been able to remove the questions of malnourishment or disease control problems, things so on and so forth. But I do think the future depends a lot on how we look at climate change itself, whether there will be societies left or lands left for us to speculate on children. If anybody is interested, there is a fantastic experiment started in the 40s by UK historians called the Mass Observation Archive, MOB. And what they did in the 40s is every year they would send a team to the people of England through the newspapers and ask ordinary people like us, who are not probably professional historians, to write about their day on that theme. And now that archive is huge. So you have 60, 70 years of everyday people writing about different themes, and I'm hoping some kind of experiment like that will help us understand the pandemic in 50, 60 years from now.
Thanks, Divya. I think there's an addition to the question about class. I don't know if, did you mean in terms of the pandemic specifically, or?
No, I was just thinking about children experiencing the pandemic in completely different ways. And, the ways in which that also reflects what we expect childhood to be, pulling out from Divya's talk, versus how it really is for some. So just in an underformed question.
Yeah, no, I understand, Swarnam. Already scholars are saying, policymakers are talking about the learning gap, right? And we see this technological boom only privileging children with access to online technology or parents who can invest in it. So we'll have to really think of, like I told you, the other institutional site of the school, which in 19th century seemed so ubiquitous. In order to save the child, put the child in school. But now you don't really need to go to school to experience that kind of schooling. So I do think the institutionalized sites of childhood will change. But given the large-scale poverty in our country and the great inequality, that will persist, and the gulf will remain. And we do see national policies not really helping on that count.
I think we have a hand up from Devati R. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Prajnya and Divya, for this really mind-opening talk. I just wanted to share a few concerns. One is about Amy Carmichael and the Donavur experiment. It's in Tamil Nadu and not in Andhra. And the important thing is Amy Carmichael, the first two girls who were taken in were Devadasi children. And the home Amy founded was to attend to the Devadasi crisis and the practice of dedicating really young children into the Devadasi mode. It is complicated. I run a children's home and we work with nomadic tribal children. So we practically grapple with these questions on a daily basis, not from an academic concern so much, but about what is it that is right? Because there are these larger questions that exist, and most of which too, I agree with Divya and the larger concerns. But we should also look at the lot of autobiographies written by the Dalit writers and women, and autobiographical notes. I just wanted to share what has been going on in my mind. If you look at the early activists, women activists who have come from the Dalit Bahujan communities, like Krishnamal Jagannathan, who's like almost going to be a centenarian soon, this Gandhian woman who worked for land rights and all. She went to a convent hostel. And similarly, Ponuttai Ammal, who runs a very school for Dalit children she's no more. And she started this first Gandhian school in Pottalupatti in Dindigul. She also goes to the same school. And many of these people, many of these women, feminists, or I consider them as feminist foremothers, they all have gone to some kind of an institution, a hostel, and which in turn results in many of Indian women creating these kind of spaces like hostels and schools. So that's also another trajectory, not to counter the whole colonial gaze, I totally agree on that. And many of those photographs, Amy Carmichael's photo archive is huge. I don't think she's a photographer, but that photo archive shows us different children in different caste settings. And she constantly writes about what she sees in these villages. And we see different descriptions of children in different caste settings. And it is probably the only visual archive that's available of Tamil Nadu's children at that time, mostly through missionary visits and trying to, their own visits to convert rather. And also there's another aspect that we have to see, much of work on disability with children. For example, the Braille was brought into Tamil Nadu by the first blind school for children was started by, not by Amy, but by another woman missionary in the same Tirunelveli region near Palayam Kotai. The school still exists, and a lot of work done on child marriage again, and the vivid descriptions of these really young children going to the altar, or whatever we call it, the pandal, and how they're being stopped, and widow remarriage and all these things. And how do we bring that in? Because we do take caste as an, when we take caste into the framework, then the experience, then when we agree that the experiences of caste by children are extremely different. For that, we have so much of literary sources. So how do we bring that into our own understanding of analyzing these interventions also? Yes, there is a colonial project. Yes, there is a missionary project, but it seems to have, in my personal, it's just an observation, I'm not qualified to make an, but it seemed to have made a huge difference, because when we say how these kids were put into work in these homes, it is true. And it is probably true till date, like this kids working in these homes and learning. It's now we call it life skill, but it is work. It is homework, and it's cooking and cleaning, and who cleans. Those are questions that we should always ponder about. But what is it really? What the education and the opportunities and the protection? What it has meant for so many of these children is also somewhere needs to be looked at and accounted. I feel like I just want to know your thoughts on these.
No, thank you so much for that. And firstly, I'm sorry for incorrectly saying Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh. But I agree with you, Revati, there, in the sense, because I did my PhD on the missionaries, and my friends always tease me that I'm sympathetic to missionaries, and I genuinely am, because you also have to give them credit for the fact that in a country that was so stratified and inhumanly treated a large group of people, these missionaries are coming and learning the languages and living amongst them. Even the colonial officials are not doing it. So despite all the other vices they may have had, and all the problems of colonial ways of thinking, I as a historian do acknowledge the fact that if not for the missionaries, many subaltern populations would not have received any kind of formal schooling or the right to enter institutional spaces. So it's not just about schools, even entering hospitals. We have not just the Dalits but the Nadar community in Tamil Nadu have had a rich history of engaging with the British missionaries, LMS and CMS. Like you mentioned, Sarah Tucker's school in Palayam Kota, and so on and so forth. But of course, like you also rightly pointed out, Revati, it is a complicated question, because in Amy Donohoe's case, and this is from borrowing from others who have worked on her, these single women missionaries faced a very different challenge as opposed to married women missionaries. So married women missionaries, firstly, were not considered to be employees of the organization. They were seen as just companions to their missionary husbands, and they were expected to emulate their so-called ideal family in the colony. Now this changes when single women missionaries like Amy Donohoe come, and they assert themselves, and the way she carried herself and how she treated everybody in the campus there, that created a lot of tension for her own home committee who employed her, and I think a lot of the complications that you are pointing out has a larger story. It's not just about her personal intentions, personal affection towards the children, but the kind of structures that she was also straddling. We have to remember these missionaries are coming into these strange lands and picking up new languages and leaving their homes behind. That in itself involves some kind of sacrifice, but they are also straddling patriarchal tendencies in the organization. When it comes to the Devdasi children, the thing is, very often there has been a moralistic outlook on that. Even Muthulakshmi Reddy's formulations, very often people tend to take a righteous stance on that, and I think that is where Amy Carmichael has been critiqued by scholars. On one hand, she has portrayed this mission of rescuing them from this terrible life, giving them a second chance, but at the same time, she probably was one of the few people who even wanted to engage with these children. So I completely agree with you that these are very, very complex and at the same time ambiguous encounters. One can't say that she loved them and hated them. There are elements of race and superiority and gender and control, and yet the children also reacting, right? Very often you have to remember the children are also basking in the joy of being there and getting proper food and accommodation, and the opportunity to move beyond their location. I agree with that. And the caste question does two things, Revati, and thank you for highlighting it. One is however limited it might have been, it is a story of liberation. Dalits are allowed into the school. So I didn't probably make it clear in the talk that while the children are made to do these kind of, let's say, menial labor, what they would have anyway done outside of the school still allows them a chance to be literate. It still allows them to shape some form of respectability or forge notions of respectability through clothing. And this is an example from Kerala, that in the boarding schools, children were made to wear uniform, blouses. We also know about the breastcloth controversy, but school children were the first ones to wear the blouse. And for lower caste children, this was a great sign of liberation, empowerment at a time when they were not allowed to cover their breasts. So there are these other material changes that are happening. You have the earliest school teachers coming from these communities. I wouldn't say Dalit for Kerala, but usually the Irava, Nadar, Tia communities, OBC communities today, they have the first teachers, the nurses, and which has a longer history of Christians in nursing. So there have been an opening of opportunities. The question is, like you said, more literary and discursive. What does the figure of the poor child do? And we see that the missionaries really had a compromising stance on caste. And that has been one of the unfortunate things about Indian Christianity, that caste remains a major point. You can all be Christians, but your caste also is attached to your status as a Christian. And the missionaries unfortunately had a role to play in maintaining it. And I think as a historian that was a pragmatic stance. They did it for survival because they could not have upset the upper caste so much, because the upper caste were threatening to burn schools. They did burn schools. They were beating them up. They were attacking their converts. And at the same time, they wanted to keep their outcast converts with them, because after all, they were the converts and the upper caste were few. So the missionary is an in-between figure. Wants the upper caste, but they are not converting, but has to also favor the huge Dalit population. And we see later, by the 20th century, the communities themselves asserting their rights and forming associations and becoming members of IMCA, so on and so forth. So the missionaries, I think, are complex cultural characters. And caste, what it does in the question of childhood is it also critiques this universal model, but also reveals that in India, suddenly the universal model today is the upper class, middle class. Everybody wants to be the middle class, upper class child. And I think visual advertisements are the best example of how that idea is being recreated. All these fair looking, healthy looking children on TV who has a very specific class character to them are now the new universal child for the Indian poor child. But my research interest, Revati, is a little further from what you had mentioned, is look at the poor child in this developmentalist imagination and what are the colonial roots. Even today, when you talk about Indian children in international circles, it's the poor child that constantly comes up. And I'm interested in what is the longer history behind that. So the poor child's image is constantly circulated as the face of the Indian child, but in a very, I would say, in a very derogatory, denegatory manner. And then that is used to generalize all of Indian developments. But I completely agree with you. It's a very complicated history. One could say love and hate. And just a trivia for all of you here, missionaries who had children, very few of them educated their children in India. They had to send their children back by the age of 7 or 8 because they thought that their children would become too native if they continued living here and playing with Indian children. And also fear of the tropics, worried that tropical climate would kill their children. So race has a bit of a double standard here. Their children are packed off by the age of 8, or they're sent to these hill station boarding schools. And the missionaries don't see their children for many, many decades, in fact. But Indian children have to partake of all local circumstances. Race is, I would still argue that race is perceptible in these circumstances. It's not very clear how they take shape when they collide with caste. It's race and caste colliding in many occasions. But thank you for that observation.
Thanks, Divya. Revati, did you want to add anything?
No, thank you very much. And I just, not to make this into a thing, but Amy Carmichael, for that matter, she becomes paralyzed from chest below, and she still remained in India. She didn't go back, even though that was the ideal thing, and things were like really falling apart around her. And a lot of these children who stayed with her, who were supposed to call her Amma, and they still call her as Amma in Donavur missionary, which is also falling apart right now with a lot of course, the present situation in this country. And some of them have written actually what is meant to it. We need not take it as like face value, but it is one archive that's available. I have not really accessed it completely. I didn't find the time, but when I visited Amy's library, a lot of these children who grew up and became something else. For example, the the father I met who runs the Donavur mission now, his mother was one of the children that Amy brought up, and he said that many of them have written stuff, and Amy also writes about this conflict within the missionaries about which children to, which caste to look in and which identity to take in many of our correspondences. So just wanted to add that.
No, you're right. The missionary, this is for anybody younger than me who's interested here also. The missionary archives are very rich. They are amateur everything, amateur photographers, amateur cyclists, zoologists, botanists. They are participating in knowledge production. I mean, we can debate the imperial value of it. They are also involved in museum collections. And this letter writing is interesting because missionaries would make children in their schools write letters. Very often they would translate it and publish it, the English publications in the journals, in order to also, like I said, to get donations. But of course, there are debates on the mediation. A lot of it is translated and what is lost in translation. But that is an archive. There is something called the International Missionary Photography Archive. And if many of you are not aware, the missionaries were they loved the camera. And the camera gave them a stronger weapon to publicize what they were doing. So millions and millions of photographs were taken in the colonies. And then, of course, material objects were taken to museums. But thanks, Revati, for that. Yeah.
Divya, I actually had a question. I was really struck by how you situated the child in all these sort of institutions that were often making decisions on their behalf. Of course, you also brought out how children do still have agency within these structures. And I was firstly wondering, you focused, I think, a little more on the white child and the kind of agency they had. I was wondering what the historical sources might say about the agency of perhaps Indian children in the colonial period, and also from a particularly gendered lens, I was wondering if you could maybe speak about things like the age of consent, debate that was happening, because I know, of course, Tanika Sarkar and others have written about this, and if you can find any parallels with maybe what we are seeing today in terms of, again, women's bodies and really young women's bodies and how decisions are being made about them.
No, I can see Sony here. Sony has worked on missionary orphanages, so Sony, feel free to add comments to this. So agency, that's exactly my point, Shakti. How do we then determine agency? Are we looking at acts of direct, overt, loud resistance? But, historians such as Sony, myself, Karen Valgada, we're looking at pockets of resistance or the failure of the project in itself to say that something obviously didn't go the way they wanted in the establishment. For instance, children running away. Karen Valgada often talks about children running away, for various reasons. Some of them hated the corporal punishment. Missionaries were infamous for being very strict in many schools. So not just missionaries, even domestic elites who ran schools. So running away as a form of resistance. Later, we see many children participating, not just from the orphanages, but in other schools in the nationalist movement, entering into student strikes, disobeying their English masters, participating in the Swadeshi movement. So becoming politicized subjects, that has been a form of resistance. There have also been resistance of children just disobeying their superiors. And just as a fact, it might be a small trivia to add, but the white people in India are absolutely outnumbered by the Indians. So you basically have maybe 3 or 4 missionary teachers, or maybe some British officials in a huge population, and that also speaks to hegemony, ideological hegemony over people. But a lot of the failures can be turned around to say maybe these were acts of resistance, or even letters. So Revati mentioned letters. In my own work, when I look at a school in Masulipattnam, and these missionaries would constantly tell the girls, you have to write letters because we want to publish it in the journal for donations. Children would write very ordinary letters. They would say, yeah, the sun is bright here, we like playing. And because the missionary expected them to write in a way that spoke to their stereotypical imagination of the Indian child. Because they wanted the children to write, we are grateful to the teacher for everything we have been given, our parents don't do anything. But children don't really write that. So in one of the letters I see from the girls' school, the Telugu girls' school in Masulipattnam, the girl says, I have heard the English have great gardens, so can you send me some seeds next time you write to me? Somebody says, I want to go to the seaside for my holiday. So absolutely, in real and experiential terms, children are writing about their lives. And one could look at it as as an agency, as a form of agentic reaction. But then all kinds, like I said, some are conforming, some are participating. The boarding schools had a monitorial system. So the elderly girls or boys would look after the younger ones. And there is evidence that some of them did participate in beating younger children, taking the role of the monitor very too seriously. Some in order to get jobs, some also genuinely thought they were better Christians than the other children, and then taking on those roles. So I would say that just like you ascribe agency to adults, so there is a varied agentic reactions for children also in this film. Now, the age of consent, of course, is a bigger debate. I would really point everybody to the work of Ishita Pandey. Her new book is on Child Marriage Restraint Act, and where she compares it with age of consent. But more than age of consent, Shakti, just to relate to the topic, Eliza Kent, who has worked on the Nadar community and the Christian missionary, she has a very interesting conceptualization. She says, while liberation was a potential, that you could be literate and all, what does it mean for gender and sexuality? Christian missionaries were actually very conservative. And she coins the term restrictive form of femininity. So on one hand, they're reading and writing and they're physically now more visible. They're not doing agricultural labor as much. But in terms of moral attitudes, the missionaries have a very, very conservative notion of who the Christian woman should be. Should be an ideal mother, ideal wife. So motherhood is very closely tied to childhood. And we now know that this is not specific to Christians. All communities, a good child means you ought to have a good mother, and the mother receives the greatest burden or the flack for not raising a good child. So the question about gender and bodies, there is a lot of contestation over female children's bodies. And one of the concern is to keep them away from sexual activities, both not just from adults but from boys. There is not much evidence, but there is some work in South Africa, for instance, on masturbation was a big concern in these institutions, and co-education was not really encouraged even by other castes. Even conservative upper caste did not want co-education. If you were a Christian convert, many missionaries would arrange the marriage for you with a Christian boy from the boarding school. So they also had certain standards of, or the idea of the ideal family to be produced. And the Christian mother being seen as somebody who will stay at home, take care of the child. For instance, stitching. Sewing is a very common activity taught in schools, as opposed to boys doing sports or something like that. And a lot of work has shown that sewing as a restrictive form of femininity. Girls as docile, but also it's an economic asset. A mother who knows how to stitch will also repair clothes. Men clothes, so on and so forth. So there is contestation over the sexuality of the girls. There is the idea of how their bodies ought to be covered and how they should be displayed in the public. And we see that playing out. So I won't talk about age of consent in detail. That's a huge subject. But the Christians are participating in the public life of looking at property rights. Divorce is not really encouraged by many churches at this time. So marriage as a form of controlling institution, so on and so forth. But there is also not much evidence on, let's say, the everyday sexual activities or practices of children. One gets it through what we call cryptic language. So, for instance, the Basel missionaries often say in their reports, today I beat this girl very much. She just won't listen to me. Now, one doesn't know why they are beating the girl. What is this not listening? Some will say that, we don't want young male teachers to teach our high school girls. And that is an indication of the sexual anxieties that pervade this question. But yes, age of consent, the idea of later what becomes the Child Marriage Restraint Act question, age of majority, all of that is being discussed. I know it comes across as I'm talking only about Christian missionaries, but please remember domestic elites are also participating in boarding school pedagogies. The Arya Samaj is reframing children's bodies as the body of the muscular Hindu nation in the making. So in the 1920s, all these DAV schools in Uttar Pradesh are teaching self-defense classes, Sanskrit classes, to reshape the idea of the Hindu youth, Hindu male who can take on the Hindu nation. So the national imagination plays out very, very much in these pedagogies as well.
Thanks, Divya. We have.
Can I just have, sorry.
Sure, no, go ahead, Revati.
No, I just wanted to point out that the Juvenile Justice Act of 2015 again says boys and girls have to be segregated. So this has become our legalistic mindset also, like passed on by all these experiments of this global situation. I wanted to add. If I can ask a question, if there is time. So how do we really find out about what children were thinking, because most of the time childhood is always a memory, like when you do it later as an adult, and whether it's, as you mentioned, whether it's troubled or happy, it's always from retrospect. So how exactly do we access not going into their thoughts and dreams as much, but even as like practical things. How do we access children in that way, especially in a history project?
Yeah.
How do you?
So if you're looking at children in the past, I am one of those people, Revati, who has reconciled to not finding much of what children wrote. When I was doing my PhD, I was desperate to find what children left behind, but it's not very easy, at least in the South Asian context. Unlike Europe, which has had a greater history of archiving, and they document every small thing, that has not been the case in South Asian communities for various social and political reasons. But there are a lot of methods that anthropologists and sociologists are now doing. One, of course, is the autobiography. There are a lot of oral histories that they are doing, either with teenagers, with youth. When COVID happened, a lot of anthropologists started projects looking at children's idea of play, what kind of games they play indoors and outdoors. There have been experiments with children asking them to keep diaries of the pandemic. Art has been used. A lot of art educators ask children to draw. But historically, again, like I said, when they are children, they don't produce much to be left behind. It is only in adulthood, and there is the problem of filtering, right? If you're a famous person, you don't want to reveal everything about your childhood. It depends on your status as an adult. There is autobiography, there is, like I said, photography. If you look at partition survivors, they are talking about their childhood. Many of them were young children when they left India to go to Pakistan, so on and so forth. So historically, it is tough, but I hope I'm wrong. But maybe I would say it is possible to do for, let's say, 20th century better than 19th century. I have friends who are archaeologists who say it's difficult for them. They are also looking at pottery and bones, but it's a very difficult question. But if you're interested in 1940s, 50s, 60s, there is perhaps school exercise books. One of the sources that I also look at in my work is school textbooks. How are children represented in the textbook is a source. But again, not children are not writing it. These are all representations of children. But if you're interested, like I said, advertisements or children's stories in the 90s, a lot of it, the thing is, we are so obsessed with literacy, right? You need children to write something. We'll have to look at objects. We'll have to look at material culture, their dresses, their toys. I would say it's still more easier for recent periods than in periods way in the past. And that is why I very clearly told you a couple of times, we are not looking at children per se anymore. We're looking at childhood as a category. That allows us to be a bit more flexible. If anybody is interested, there's a great project called Childhood Publics. It's run by sociologists and historians in London. You will see the website Childhood Publics. They have given cameras to children in the last 5-6 years and asked them to document their lives. So huge archive of children photographing their everyday life. And like Swarna said, maybe in 2072, this would be a fantastic archive.
We have a question from Deepthi K. Has there been evidence of erasure of sexuality or gender identities during colonization, such as transgender identities?
Yeah. Thanks so much for this, Deepthi. I didn't speak about it, but I did mention the author who talks about it, Jessica Hinchey. I'm unfortunately not an expert on the field, but Jessica Hinchey has a book called The Hijra in Colonial India. And she has written quite a bit about, not in terms of childhood per se, but how the colonial North Indian government was interested, or they spent some years trying to exterminate the Hijra. They eventually failed at it. But the question of suppressing or erasing children's sexual identities was very predominant there, and this was a big concern. Transgender was a big concern for the Victorian British. They strictly wanted people either to be male or female and identified by their dress, and they really struggled for many years to. When I say exterminate, literally get them off, kill them off, in the sense send them to camps and segregate them forever. It didn't really work in colonial North India because lower level officials didn't really bother or cooperate. But yes, cross-dressing was not something that the British government allowed, or absolutely homophobic. There were complaints about the sexual activities in juvenile reformatories, in boys' juvenile reformatories. They were constantly whipped. According to the 1864 Whipping Act, juveniles could be whipped, and whipping was something used for military people who disobeyed in the military. But that same punishment was used on boys in the juvenile reformatories until the 1920s. And again, this goes back to race, that while they banned whipping in England, they continued whipping young boys in India. And perhaps it may have been because of homosexual activities. But I would actually direct you to Jessica Hinchey's work on transgender. But that is again the problem. We are not able to find out information on heterosexual children, it becomes even difficult to find information on transgender children per se. But there are histories on transgender communities. There is some histories on that.
We also have a question about convent schools and really how they've perhaps Indianized over the decades post-independence, I suppose. Would you happen to know of any history on this?
Yeah, so Swarna, just to just in conclusion, I know everyone's probably waiting to go, but thank you for saying that, because many of us have, I myself went to a Christian school, and I can confidently say that my parents never had a fear that I would be Christian. But the value of Christian education was important. That is whole idea of disciplining, learning good English, being on time, dressing neatly. So what I argue also in my work is that more than conversion, the success of the project is Christianization. Even the most conservative Hindus and Muslims today don't mind their children going to a convent. That is also because the assumption that religious identity is something that will be governed by the family in the space of the home. So let the school have their prayers and music and chorus and all of that, but we are very confident that our child will not be a convert, one. But two, this is a cultural capital. Going to a school run by either, especially the convent sisters, is a matter of cultural capital. And also, remember, there is a convergence. I also want to point out, and that's why your question is relevant, your comment is relevant. It's not that the communities are constantly a loggerhead. When it comes to disciplining young people, all religions really converge on some idea, especially young girls. So this is linked to Revati's question, Deepli's question. So disciplining young female sexuality, Hindus, Muslims, Christians all converge, and therefore the Christian school is the ideal space to send your girl students. Some of the missionary schools continue to remain famous. So you have, the Lovedale, or you have a lot of these hill station schools in Shimla, the LMS schools, the Scott Church College in Nagarkoil. They've all later played an important role. Again, if anybody is interested, Chandra Mallampalli, his work also shows that this generation of Christians who are coming out of schools in the 1900s actively participate in the nationalist movement, because they are in a dilemma. They are being accused of having let's say, being converts of a foreign religion, quote unquote, and yet they want to define themselves as Indian Christians, something that the minorities today still have to face. So many Christians are actively involved in the nationalist movement. They don't see that kind of a split. They don't think Christianity is a foreign, because when it's adopted, it takes on local forms of prayer. I know this in Kerala. Christians light lamps. A lot of the preaching happens in local languages, and therefore there is a lot of adaptation and give and take between communities. So there is something called Indian Christianity, and that governs how they look at their participation in national life. But this question about the convents, I always find it fascinating. The ideal school is the convent, despite being strict and controlling and all of that. It just shows a convergence of agendas in India.
And it's also aspirational, because then you go to a convent, and then the next generation goes to a better convent, and then finally you go to I don't know what private and public schools are, but like a posher school. Yeah. So it's also a change you see over time, I think. I'm now completely in nostalgic mode, which is very easy to happen at this point. So trying to remember details I've forgotten.
Okay, I think really maybe on that note, we will wrap up, because it is almost noon. Let me see. We do have, comments, Divya, for you, thanking you for your talk. I think there's just a question from Naini Swami. Just to wrap up, I'll say, is there any platform where I may continue to follow Divya's work? If you'd like to leave in the chat box this information for people.
Sure. So I have a collective called the CCYSC. It has 350 members. I started this with a colleague who's a sociologist in Ambedkar University. She's a sociologist of education and youth and childhood. So if anybody wants to be members of the CCYSC, what we do is we put together, people who have similar interests. Even if I don't work on law per se, there will be others who work on this. There is quite a bit of work on law and childhood. There is someone called Oishik Sarkar in Jindal University who works on this. I probably got his spelling wrong. There is Sujata Subramanian, who's been looking at the Juvenile Justice Act. So if you go onto the website, you will find a lot of work there. That is one way. And there are policy groups who also look at, because that's a very, very relevant topic in terms of children and legal research. So you can be a member of the CCYC, and if you write to us, we will take it up from there.
Thank you, Divya. Just to say, our next gender talk is on 12th March. It will be featuring Professor Srimati Basu, who is a professor at the University of Kentucky, who will be speaking on the law and gender and various aspects of how those intersect. Thank you again very much, Divya. I think all of us really enjoyed your talk.